The wind cut across the prairie like a knife, howling through the crooked boards of the old cabin. Snow piled against the door, rattling the windows in their frames. Inside, a fire cracked and popped in the stove, spilling warmth into the room. Yet outside, under the weight of that winter storm, the old man's dog stood watch. The mutt had every chance to come in. The door was left open, the fire waiting for him, the old man calling softly with the promise of warmth. But the animal never budged. He stayed out on the porch, fur dusted in frost, his eyes fixed on the tree line as though something out there was worth freezing for. The old man muttered under his breath. He couldn't understand it. He had raised that dog from a pup, watched him chase jackrabbits and laze by the hearth all through summers past. But lately the dog had changed. Nights were different now. No matter how bitter the wind, he refused to cross the threshold. The man tried everything. He coaxed with scraps, whistled low, even tried to drag the beast in by the collar once. But the dog dug his paws in, teeth bared, not at the man, but at the darkness beyond the yard. It wasn't rebellion. It was protection, a kind of stubborn guard duty that no comfort could override. So night after night the ritual repeated. The old man sat alone by the stove, sipping weak coffee, listening to the creak of the timbers, and just outside his faithful companion sat stiff in the cold, breath rising like steam, ears twitching at every whisper of the wind. At first the old man chalked it up to old instincts, maybe coyotes or a stray wolf scenting the ridge. But deep down, something unsettled him. The dog wasn't just wary. He was ready. Ready for something the man couldn't see. And on the harshest nights, when the moonlight painted the prairie silver, the old man swore he saw movement too. Shadows in the tree line. A figure here, a flicker there, just enough to keep him awake, staring at the frosted glass, wondering what kept his dog frozen at that door. The mystery clung to him like smoke. Why wouldn't the animal cross the threshold? What danger had him standing guard, night after night, as if the fate of the ranch depended on it? The answer would come soon enough. And when it did, it would change everything. The dog wasn't the only one who had grown restless with the passing years. Inside that cabin, hunched by the stove's fading glow, sat a man whose own bones felt as weathered as the prairie outside. His name had once carried weight in saloons and dusty main streets, whispered in the corners where men gambled and gun smoke hung heavy. But now, he was just another drifter who stayed put too long. His face bore the map of hard roads, creases like dry riverbeds, scars that caught the light when he leaned close to the fire. A thin line ran from his jaw to his ear, carved there by a knife fight decades back. Another scar, deeper and older, was hidden beneath his shirt, running over his ribs like a reminder of how close he'd come to death. But no mark showed the one wound that never healed, the kind carried behind the eyes. He wasn't always alone. Once he'd ridden with men who called him brother. Once he'd loved a woman who waited at the window when he rode into town. But that was years ago, before gunfights and whiskey took the best of him, before the West itself changed, railroads cutting across land, lawmen chasing down the last of the wild. The world had marched on, and he was left behind in the dust. Now he lived quiet. Worked odd jobs when the money ran out, fixed fences, cut wood. He didn't ask for company, and folks didn't offer much in return. To most who passed through, he was just an old hand too stubborn to quit. But his dog was different. The animal never judged, never left, never questioned why his master sat up nights staring into the fire as though ghosts lived in the flames. Still, there was something about the dog's devotion that unsettled him. It was more than loyalty. It was as if the creature knew him better than he knew himself. The way the dog's eyes lingered when he stirred from another nightmare. The way he pressed close on nights when the man's hands shook. It wasn't pity. It was duty. And duty was something the old cowboy understood. He'd lived most of his life by it, though it had cost him nearly everything he cared about. Days slipped by in silence. He rose with the sun, worked his hands raw, and came back to the cabin with nothing but the sound of the dog's paws trailing behind him. At dusk, he'd sit with coffee gone cold, looking out over the plains. Sometimes he'd swear he could still hear echoes of the past, gunfire bouncing off canyon walls, shouts of men who were long buried. The dog would sit at his feet then, head cocked, as if listening too. And for a brief moment, the old man felt less alone. But the past has a way of finding men who try to bury it. And though he didn't know it yet, the scars he carried weren't done bleeding. That strange behavior of his dog, the long vigils in the cold, the watchful stance at the tree line, was no accident. Because somewhere out there, in the shadows of the valley, danger was moving closer. And soon, the old cowboy would be forced to pick up the part of himself he thought he had laid down for good. That night, the dog's growl cut sharper than the wind. It wasn't the playful rumble he made at coyotes on the ridge, nor the warning bark he gave to passing travelers. This was low, steady, and dangerous, the kind of sound that told a man something was out there, watching. The old cowboy pushed back his chair and stepped onto the porch, shotgun balanced in his hands. His breath frosted in the cold night air, and the boards creaked beneath his boots. The dog stood rigid in the yard, fur bristling, eyes locked on the tree line that stretched like a black wall, across the valley. At first the man saw nothing, just the shifting shadows of branches swaying in the wind. But the dog didn't move. His gaze never wavered. That's when the cowboy spotted it. A shape that didn't belong. A darker patch of shadow slipping behind a tree, gone as quickly as it came. The old man cursed under his breath. He trudged down into the yard, lantern in one hand, shotgun in the other. The snow crunched beneath him as he walked to the edge of his property. There, half buried in the drift, he saw them. Fresh prints, heavy boots. Too many for one man. His stomach tightened. These weren't the tracks of hunters or harmless drifters. Whoever had passed through had done so with purpose, and they had stopped close. Too close. He ran his hand over his beard, thinking. The dog snarled again, circling, nose low to the ground, confirming what his eyes already told him. Someone had been out there, circling the ranch. The next morning the news spread quick. A neighbor rode up, breathless, with worry etched deep in his face. He warned of rustlers cutting through the valley, men who'd already driven off cattle, poisoned wells, and left one rancher beaten within an inch of his life. "They're bold," the neighbor said, gripping the reins tight. "And worse, they ain't afraid of killing. If they've set their sights on you, best be ready." The cowboy said little, just nodded, jaw tight, eyes narrowing under the brim of his hat. He'd tried to leave violence behind, tried to live quiet, but he knew the kind of men the neighbor spoke of. He'd seen their kind before, sharks that smelled weakness, circling till they could strike. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, the dog once again refused to cross the threshold. He planted himself in the dirt by the porch, staring at the same tree line, his body taut as a coiled spring. The old man didn't force him this tutoring. He simply sat inside, lantern flickering low, and listened to the steady growl rolling from the yard. It struck him then. This was no ordinary stubbornness. His dog wasn't just keeping watch, he was holding a line, protecting something the old man had overlooked. And as the prairie night stretched long and silent, the cowboy realized his loyal companion had been trying to warn him all along. Trouble was already here. Trouble was waiting in the dark. The dog's bark tore through the quiet morning like a rifle shot. It wasn't a sound meant for coyotes or wandering cattle. It was aimed at men. men who now stood bold on the horizon. By midday, the signs were clear. A stretch of fencing trampled flat. Posts ripped from the ground like matchsticks. The old man rode out, jaw set tight, to find hoofprints and wagon ruts carving deep scars into his land. Someone wanted him to know they'd been there. Someone wanted him afraid. The dog followed close, ears pricked, nose twitching at every turn. When they reached the south pasture, the smell hit first, sour and wrong. The trough water shimmered with a greasy film, the kind left by poison. The old man's stomach sank. These weren't simple thieves. They were predators, bleeding a ranch slow before striking hard. That evening, he sat on the porch, shotgun across his lap, while the dog prowled the yard like a restless sentinel. The wind carried faint laughter from somewhere out in the valley. Men camped just far enough away to keep out of sight, but close enough to remind him they were watching. Days later, the warnings grew bolder. A note pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife. Sell and leave, or be buried where you stand. The old cowboy held the paper in his scarred hands, staring at the jagged letters scrawled in haste. He'd seen threats before, but this one carried weight. These men weren't bluffing. He tried to reason with himself. He'd lived through too much blood, too many nights where gunsmoke choked the air. He told himself he was too old to fight another war. He could leave and sell what little land he had, drift off to another town, another shack, another set of empty days. But every time he looked at the dog, standing firm in the dirt, eyes locked on the hills, he knew running wasn't in the cards. The animal wouldn't abandon this ground, and maybe, just maybe, neither could he. The gang's cruelty didn't stop at threats. They drove cattle through his pasture, tearing up what grass was left. One night they set fire to a haystack, flames licking the sky while the old man and his dog fought to douse it. He worked till his arms trembled, smoke choking his lungs, and still the dog refused to back down, snarling into the darkness at shadows that slipped away before dawn. Sleep grew thin. The cowboy sat awake most nights, lantern burning low, shotgun close at hand. Outside, the dog planted himself at the porch steps, body stiff, eyes never leaving the tree line. No matter how bitter the wind or how heavy the snow, he didn't move. And then came the closest warning yet. The old man woke one morning to find a carcass, one of his steers, slain and left in the yard, throat cut, blood black in the frost. A message written in flesh. The dog stood over the body, hackles raised, a growl rolling deep from his chest. He hadn't left the carcass all night, as if daring the killers to return. The old cowboy felt the weight of it then. This was no longer a test of land or pride. It was survival. He looked out over the valley, the hills dark against the setting sun, and he knew the fight was coming closer with every passing hour. He poured coffee into a chipped mug, sat down on the porch, and stared into the same horizon his dog would not stop watching. The silence between them spoke louder than words. Neither man nor beast would yield. The siege had begun. The dog's snarl was the first warning. It started low in his chest, then rose to a vicious growl that cut through the night like a blade. His body stiffened, ears forward, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the yard. The old man froze where he sat by the lantern. He had heard that sound before, once, long ago, when survival balanced on the edge of a trigger. And then came the gunfire. The first shot slammed into the barn wall, splintering timber. Another whined past the cabin window. The old cowboy rolled from his chair, shotgun in hand, as the lamp went dark with a blast of glass. The night erupted with fire and lead. Men shouted from the shadows. Hooves thundered against frozen ground. Bullets struck the porch posts, shredding wood into sharp splinters. Smoke stung his nose, acrid and heavy. The old man's hands, though stiff with age, moved with deadly memory. He slid to the window frame, cocked the hammer, and fired into the dark. A scream followed. A rider tumbled from his saddle. The gang's attack had begun. The dog leapt forward, teeth bared, tearing into the first man foolish enough to rush the porch. The cowboy caught a glimpse of blood flashing in the moonlight as his companion brought the attacker down. He fired again, steady and precise, every shot placed as if he had never left the gunfighter's life. But there were too many. 6, 7, maybe more. Shapes darted in and out of the tree line, muzzle flashes lighting their faces for an instant before darkness swallowed them again. The sound of iron on wood filled the air as bullets chewed the cabin walls. The old man reloaded with hands that didn't shake. The years had dulled his body, but not his resolve. Each movement was methodical, deliberate. He knew this dance too well. The dog lunged again, driving one man back with savage fury. The cowboy heard the yelp of pain, but his partner did not falter. He returned to the porch steps, fur slicked with blood that wasn't his own, eyes glowing with the fire of battle. The attackers pressed harder. One tossed a torch, flames licking the barn roof. Another crept low toward the troughs, pistol raised. The old cowboy swung, his rifle to his shoulder, exhaled, and dropped him with a single shot. He moved like a man reborn, each trigger pull pulling him back into the world he thought he'd left. He could feel it again, the stillness before a shot, the silence between heartbeats. The part of him he'd buried was alive once more. But the gang was relentless. They circled, firing, screaming curses, trying to break his line. A bullet ripped through the porch post inches from his head. Another grazed his arm, hot and searing. He gritted his teeth, blood wetting his sleeve, but stayed on his feet. The dog tore through another shadow. Snarls mixed with gunfire, the sound of fangs on flesh drowned by another blast of rifles. The old man's chest heaved as he fired, reloaded, fired again. The yard was lit with bursts of flame, each one etching death into the night. Then, silence. The shooting slowed. The gang regrouped in the tree line. The cowboy wiped sweat and blood from his brow, listening. His dog paced at the porch edge, growl rumbling, tail stiff, warning that it wasn't over. A voice rose from the dark, low, mocking. "You can't hold out forever, old man. You're 1 against a dozen. Step out, give us what's ours, and maybe we'll let you live." The cowboy answered with silence. He tightened his grip, cocked his rifle once more. The standoff stretched thin. His body ached, lungs burning, but his eyes stayed sharp. He could see their shapes shifting in the trees, waiting for him to break. The dog barked furiously, daring them to try. And then they charged. The final rush came with torches and pistols, a wave of fire and steel crashing against the yard. The cowboy braced himself. The dog hurled forward, fangs flashing as the old man met the charge with lead. Bullets cracked, torches fell, men screamed. The night itself seemed to burn. The old man fought like the spectre of his younger sea, left every shot deliberate, every step unyielding, and beside him his dog waged war with tooth and fury, unrelenting, unstoppable. By the time the smoke cleared, the yard was littered with bodies and blood. Flames licked at the barn, but the gang was broken. The few who survived dragged themselves back into the trees, leaving behind their dead. The cowboy stood, chest heaving, rifle empty. His arm bled, his face was cut, but his eyes burned with fire. The dog limped back to his side, bloodied but alive, pressing close as if to remind him that neither of them had fought alone. The siege was over, but the night had cost them both. The cowboy leaned on the porch rail, staring out at the valley still glowing with embers. He knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The men who fled would return. They always did. But for now, he and his dog had held the line. Together, they had stood against the dark. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the crackle of fire and the dog's heavy breath, the old cowboy felt something he hadn't in years. Purpose. The dog was the first to move when the gunfire faded. His ears twitched, his head lifted, and instead of circling the yard for stragglers, he padded straight toward the barn. His paws left faint prints in the ash and snow, his steps purposeful, certain. The old man watched with a puzzled frown. His rifle hung heavy in his hands, the fight's adrenaline still running sharp through his veins. But something in the animal's posture, calm, steady, almost gentle, made him lower the barrel and follow. The barn doors groaned as he pulled them open. Inside, the air was thick with smoke from the scorched hay, but beneath that came another sound, a muffled whimper, the shuffle of feet trying not to be heard. The cowboy froze. His eyes adjusted to the dim, and there in the shadows he saw them. A woman, no older than 30, clutching a boy who couldn't have been more than 10. Their faces pale, eyes wide with fear, clothes torn from weeks on the run. The boy clung to, his mother's skirts, and the mother clutched him tighter still as the stranger stepped closer. But the dog broke the tension. He walked past the old man, tail low, and sat right at their feet. He looked up at the cowboy as if to say, "This is what I've been guarding all along." The old man's chest tightened. In an instant he understood. The gang wasn't just after land or cattle. They were hunting these two, chasing them across the valley like wolves after lambs. And his dog, wiser than him, had known it from the start. The woman's voice shook as she spoke. She told him they had once lived under the gang's thumb, her husband cut down when he resisted. She'd taken her son and fled, hiding wherever the land gave cover. But there was no hiding from men like that. They always found the scent, always closed in, until by some mercy they stumbled onto his ranch. The cowboy listened, silent, his weathered face unreadable. But inside, something shifted. For years he had told himself he was finished with fighting, that he had nothing left to protect. Yet here they stood, two souls cornered by the same darkness he had once tried to bury. And his dog. His dog had stood guard not for himself, not even for his master, but for them. The boy reached a trembling hand toward the animal, who licked it gently, tail giving the faintest wag. For the first time that night, the old man's hardened gaze softened. He set his rifle down against the stall wall. "You're safe here," he said, voice low but firm. "No one's taking you now." The widow's eyes welled, but she nodded. Relief mingled with exhaustion as she pulled her son close. The cowboy stepped outside, staring at the land stretched before him, scarred from the night's battle. He knew the gang would return, they always did, hungry and vengeful. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. The dog had chosen his fight for him, and in that choice, the man had been given something he thought he'd lost forever. A purpose, a reason to stand, a chance at redemption. As dawn broke, painting the sky in bands of red and gold, the cowboy walked back toward the cabin. The dog trotted at his side, ears pricked, no longer burdened with the need to keep vigil alone. The ranch wasn't just his now. It was a refuge. And for the first time in many years, the old man felt the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by something he could only describe as family. It was the dog who showed the change first. For the first time in weeks, when night fell, he didn't plant himself at the porch steps or keep vigil in the dirt. Instead, he padded across the cabin floor, turned twice by the hearth, and settled into the warmth of the fire. His head dropped heavy against his paws, and his breathing slowed, steady and calm. The old man watched him in silence, pipe smoke curling upward in the lamplight. That stubborn animal, who had once refused every call to come inside, now lay at peace, as if some burden had finally lifted. And with that, the cowboy understood. His dog's duty was finished. The ones he had guarded were safe. Days passed, and the ranch bore the scars of the fight. Fences broken, the barns scorched, the land torn by hooves. Yet each day, the cowboy worked with new hands beside him. The widow mended where she could, her son carrying buckets, dragging wood, and learning the rhythms of the place. The cabin echoed now, not with silence, but with voices. Soft laughter, the scrape of chairs, the sound of a boy's boots on the floor. The cowboy, once resigned to solitude, found himself speaking more than he had in years. Simple words at first, directions, small reassurances, but slowly something more. Around the supper table, stories returned, memories spilled like whiskey from a long-closed bottle. And for the first time, those memories didn't taste bitter. The woman listened quietly, her eyes carrying both grief and resilience. She had lost much, but she had not broken. The boy, though shadowed by fear, clung to each lesson the old man offered. How to saddle a horse, mend a fence, aim steady with a rifle. In those lessons, the cowboy felt the faint stir of something he thought long dead. Pride. Nights no longer stretched empty. The cabin's windows glowed warm against the prairie dark, and when the wind howled, there were voices within to answer it. The dog, once a sentinel chained to the threshold, curled deep in the home he had defended. His presence was no less fierce, but now it was softened by belonging. The cowboy would sit sometimes at the porch in the fading light, looking out across the valley where danger once gathered. His scars still ached, his years still weighed heavy, but now there was more than regret keeping him upright. There was purpose. A family he hadn't expected, given not by blood, but by chance and loyalty. And in the dog's quiet rest by the hearth, the man saw himself reflected. A fighter finally allowed to lay down his burden, knowing he had done his duty. The gang was gone, driven out, their cruelty beaten back into the hills. Justice had been won not just by bullets, but by steadfast loyalty, an animal's instinct to protect what mattered most. For the cowboy, redemption didn't come in the gunfight, nor in the bodies left behind. It came in the simple peace of sharing a meal, of hearing a boy's laughter where silence once reigned, of watching a loyal dog finally close his eyes in comfort. The prairie was still wild, still dangerous, but within the walls of that weathered cabin, the old man had found something worth living for again. The dog lay curled by the hearth, the fire's glow dancing across his fur, and for the first time in a long time, the cabin was quiet in peace, not in loneliness. His watch was over, his duty fulfilled. And in that stillness, the bond between man and animal spoke, louder than words ever could. For sometimes, it isn't guns or fences that keep the darkness away. It's loyalty. The kind that stands guard through the storm, never asking why, never faltering, even when the cost is high. That loyalty had carried the cowboy through his darkest night and led him towards something he never thought he'd find again. Family. Out on the prairie, life would go on. The wind would still howl, and shadows would still creep across the hills. But within that small cabin, there was warmth, belonging, and the quiet reminder that redemption often rides in on 4 legs. And if you've stayed with me through this tale, then you know. Every animal has its story. If you enjoyed this one, you'll want to hear the next. About the horse that led a cowboy straight into a ghost town, where the living weren't the only ones waiting.